Hello friends, in this video we will discuss about private VLAN. To understand private VLAN, let's go through with the diagram here. We have router 1 connected with switch. Switch is connected with user 1, user 2 or PC1, PC2, PC3, PC4, PC5, PC6. We have here, for example, 6 users. You can also configure IP addressing like 192.168.101.1, 192.168.101.10, 192.168.101.20, 192.168.101.30, 192.168.101.40, 192.168.101.50, 192.168.101.60. In this way, we have 6 hosts here. Now, what is our task here? We want to control their access. If we want that they should not be able to communicate each other, then what we will do? We will put them in VLANs like this host VLAN in VLAN 10. We will put PC1 in VLAN 10, PC2 in VLAN 20, and we will put this user or this host in VLAN 30. Okay, we don't have too much space here. That's why just simple. We will put this user in VLAN 10, this user in VLAN 20, this user in VLAN 30, this user in VLAN 40, this user in VLAN 50, and last one into VLAN 60. We have 6 hosts. We want that they should not be able to communicate each other. Then what we can do, we can put them in different VLAN. We have 6 hosts. Then we required here 6 VLANs. Now we want they should be able to communicate with the external network, like they should be able to communicate with the internet. So with this IP addressing, they can't communicate here. So what we need to do, we need to allocate here different network ID. 10, for example, for VLAN 10, we will use here 192.168. 192.168x.x, so 10.x, this will be 20.x, 30.x, 40.x, 50.x subnet, and 60.x subnet for each VLAN, like VLAN 10, VLAN 20, VLAN 30, VLAN 40, for VLAN 50, and for VLAN 60, we will use here different subnets. When we will use different subnets, then we need to configure inter-VLAN routing. When we will configure inter-VLAN routing, again they can communicate with the help of inter-VLAN routing. So what we need to do, 0x0.10, 0x0.20, then 0x0.30, 0x0.40, 0x0.50, and last one 0x0.60. So traffic will arrive at this virtual interface here. Then what we can do here, we can deploy here ACLs. Okay, so with the help of ACL, we can control the traffic. So what is the total efforts we need to do here? When we have some host here, we want to control their access. We have some host, we want they should not be able to communicate with each other. we need to put them in VLAN 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60. We require different subnets. Then we will allocate subnet. We will configure inter-VLAN routing. They can communicate. After that, they can communicate with the help of inter-VLAN routing. Then we need to configure ACL on the logical interface or sub interface, which we will configure on router like 0 by 0 dot 10 dot 20, 30, 40, and 50. We can deploy ACL. Then we can control. So this thing we need to do. So what is our target? Our target is only to control their access. Okay. First target, we want they should not be able to communicate with each other. To do so, we need to configure different VLAN. We require different subnet. We need to configure inter-VLAN routing, and then we need to deploy ACL here. So we have to do a lot of work when we want to control their access. Is there any another way? Is there any easy solution to obtain such functionality, or which can fulfill this task that we want to control their access? Yes, then you can use private VLAN concept. So what is private VLAN? In private VLAN, we partition a VLAN into sub VLANs without changing network ID. Okay. In private VLAN, we partition a VLAN into sub VLANs without changing network ID. Okay. Now how we can do this? Okay. Now we need to rough it. Now I'm going to rough it. Please have patience. Private VLAN. In private VLAN, we partition a VLAN into sub VLAN. For example, we have here a major VLAN like, okay, in private VLAN, we have a VLAN. 1 minute. We have here a VLAN. We have here major VLAN. That major VLAN is here 100. Okay. For example, then we will divide that VLAN into sub VLANs. Sub VLANs like, we will divide that primary VLAN into sub VLANs, and those sub VLANs we will count as okay. Again, I'm repeating here. In private VLAN, we partition a VLAN into sub VLANs. Now we have here VLAN 100, which is primary. Then we will partition 100 VLAN into sub VLANs like 200, like 300 here. Okay. Now we have here sub VLANs like 200, 300, and 400. When we will partition a VLAN into sub VLAN, or in private VLAN, we partition a primary VLAN into sub VLANs. So these are the sub VLAN. Done. When we are doing partition of a VLAN into sub VLANs, these sub VLANs are two type. Okay. First one is community. You can create community A or community B. Okay. So type is here community, or you can create it here isolated VLAN. Okay. In private VLAN, We partition a VLAN into sub-VLANs like 200, 300, and 400. When we are doing partition of a primary VLAN in sub-VLANs, those sub-VLANs are two type, community and isolated. Now question is, what is community VLAN here? Okay, what is community VLAN and what is isolated VLAN? What is community VLAN and what is isolated VLAN? So let's discuss about here community VLAN as well as in in private VLAN we use some terms. Okay, again I'm repeating because now we need to draw something more, so this diagram will not come back. In private VLAN we partition a primary VLAN like 100 into sub VLANs like 200, 300 and 400. Those sub VLANs are two type, community and isolated. Let's go through with private VLAN terms. In private VLAN, we use three terms like promiscuous port. Second one is community VLAN. And third one is here isolated VLAN. Done. Promiscuous port, community VLAN and isolated VLAN. Now we will discuss about promiscuous port, community VLAN and isolated VLAN. Let's go through with diagram. We have a router. Router is connected. We have router. Router is connected with switch. Then we need to connect host. Host 1, host 2, host 1, host 2, host 3, four, 5, 6. Done. Now, what is promiscuous port? Now we will discuss about here promiscuous port. So promiscuous port is this port. Okay, this one. This is our promiscuous port. So what is promiscuous port? Promiscuous port is a port which is connected to the gateway. So we will configure IP addresses here like 101.1. You can use 101.2, 101.2, 101.3, 101.4, 101.5, 101.6 and 101.7. Or as I told you before 2 minutes, in private VLAN, in private VLAN, we partition a VLAN like 100. We partition a VLAN into sub VLANs like 200, like 300, like 400. 200 will be here. Community 300 will be here. Community, you can create multiple community, and 400 will be here isolated. So this will be our community VLAN, community VLAN, and we have here isolated VLAN. Okay. In private VLAN, we partition a VLAN into sub VLANs without changing the network ID. Network ID will not be changed. Network ID is same of R1, R2, R1, PC1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Network is same here. In private VLAN, we are doing partition of one VLAN into sub VLANs without changing network ID. In private VLAN, we will use some terms like promiscuous port. Promiscuous port is a port which is connected to the gateway, okay, which is connected to the gateway of private VLAN. A device which is connected with promiscuous port can communicate with any community host and any isolated host. So what we are going to do, we are putting these hosts in community VLAN 200. We are putting these hosts into community VLAN 300, and we are putting these hosts into isolated VLAN 400. This is community. This is also community. And this is also secondary VLAN, which is isolated VLAN. Okay. Now, what we have done, we have divided a VLAN into sub VLANs without changing network ID. This is called private VLAN. In private VLAN, we use some terms like promiscuous port, community VLAN, isolated VLAN. So what is promiscuous port? Promiscuous port is the port, the port which is connected with gateway, that will be your promiscuous port, and this promiscuous port can communicate. This promiscuous port can communicate with any. This port can communicate with any any. This port, promiscuous port, can communicate with any community host. Yes, it can communicate with any community host, as well as it can communicate with any isolated host. So promiscuous port can communicate with community VLAN, or we can say in this way, promiscuous port can communicate with isolated VLAN, as well as this can communicate with isolated VLAN, as well as this can communicate with community VLAN. Remember it, promiscuous port can communicate with any community VLAN or any isolated VLAN, or reverse, any community VLAN and isolated VLAN, they can communicate with promiscuous port. So promiscuous port is a port which is connected to the gateway of private VLAN. A device which is connected to the promiscuous port that can communicate with any community host, as well as isolated host. Now this is about your promiscuous port. Now next is what? Next we have here community VLAN. How we can understand the community VLAN here? So community VLAN is in front of you. We have community VLAN 200 and 300. Now, what is community VLAN? Community VLAN is actually a sub VLAN. Yes, community VLAN, community VLAN is sub VLAN of private VLAN. Now we are defining, or we are going through with community VLAN. So community VLAN is a sub VLAN of private VLAN. In community VLAN, intra VLAN communication is allowed. The community host, one community host can communicate with another community host. Yes, Community VLAN is a sub-VLAN of private VLAN. In it, intra-VLAN communication is allowed, as well as community VLAN host can communicate with Promiscuous Port, but one community can't communicate with another community. Community host 200 can't communicate with 300, they can't communicate with 400. Same here, 300 is also community VLAN here. So one community host can communicate with same community. So in community VLAN, intra VLAN communication is allowed. So 200 community host will communicate with each other, 300 host will communicate with each other, but inter community communication will not be there. Only intra community communication will be there. 200 to 200, 300 to 300 communication will be there, but there will be no communication between 200 and 300. So you can define that community VLAN is a sub-VLAN of private VLAN. In it, intra-VLAN communication is allowed. One community host can communicate with Promiscuous Port. One community host can communicate with same community. One community host can communicate with same community, as well as it can communicate with Promiscuous Port, but it can't communicate with another community or isolated host here. Same here, in community 300, intra-VLAN communication is allowed. It can communicate with gateway, but it can't communicate with 200 and 400. So in community VLAN, intra VLAN communication is allowed. So what is here isolated VLAN? To go understand isolated VLAN, have a look on the diagram. We have in isolated VLAN, we have here how many hosts? We have here two hosts in isolated VLAN. In isolated VLAN, intra VLAN communication is not allowed. One isolated host can't communicate with same in isolated VLAN. There is no intra VLAN communication. What is isolated VLAN? Isolated VLAN is also a sub VLAN of private VLAN. Okay, in isolated VLAN, intra VLAN communication is not allowed, but isolated host can communicate with Promiscuous Port. Promiscuous Port can communicate with isolated host. Again, I am repeating, in isolated VLAN, intra VLAN communication is not allowed, as well as isolated host can't communicate with community 300 or community 200. Isolated VLAN, intra-VLAN communication is not allowed, as well as they can't communicate with other community. They can only communicate with Promiscuous Port, and Promiscuous Port can communicate with them. So in this way, you can define here that in private VLAN, we can partition a VLAN into sub VLANs. Like we have 100, we are creating partition of 100 in 200, 300 and 400. 200 will be primary, 200, 300, 400 will be here secondary. 200 is community, 300 is community, 400 is here isolated. Got it? So 200 in community VLAN, intra-VLAN communication is allowed, but no inter-community. In community 300, intra-VLAN communication is allowed, but no inter-community communication is allowed. In isolated VLAN, no intra-VLAN communication is there, no inter-VLAN communication is there, but they can communicate with Promiscuous Port. So these are the terms about your private VLAN, where we partition a VLAN into sub-VLANs without changing network ID. We will use some terms: Promiscuous Port, community VLAN, isolated VLAN. Promiscuous Port is connected with gateway. It can communicate with any community and isolated host. Reverse, any community and isolated host can communicate with Promiscuous Port. Community VLAN. In community VLAN, intra-VLAN communication is allowed, as well as, but they can communicate with Promiscuous Port, but one community can't communicate with another community, as well as isolated host. In isolated VLAN, there is no intra-VLAN communication, as well as they can't communicate with another community, but they can communicate with Promiscuous Port. So this was something about your private VLAN. Thank you.